Ecclesiastes 6 says, "All the toil of man is for his mouth, yet his appetite is not satisfied." A couple of verses later, it says, "Better is the sight of eyes than the wandering of the appetite." This feels like it implies our appetites are wrong. Yet if they're wrong, then why did God give them? This week on Reverberate, Pastor Jed, Pastor Isaias, and I look at our appetites. Ecclesiastes warns us about the wandering appetite, yet it also calls on us to enjoy God's good gifts. So how can we enjoy those gifts without worshiping them? Let's get into it. Ecclesiastes 6 says, "All the toil of man is for his mouth, yet his appetite is not satisfied." And then a little bit later it says, "Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite." So this feels like it's viewing our appetites as wrong or negative. If that's the case, why do we even have thirsts and appetites? We have appetites for food, shelter, money, control, relationships. So are these desires for these things in of themselves sinful, or is it just what we do with these desires that can cross the boundary into sin?
I think there's two pieces we have to deal with. First of all is, what is Solomon actually saying about our appetites or desires? We need to make sure we understand what he's saying, and then to recognize that when we list the kinds of things that we desire, we sometimes include different things as if they're the same when they're actually different. For example, I might have a desire to lie, and I might have a desire for food, but those are two very different kinds of desires scripturally. So to distinguish what the different kinds of desires are, which ones are potentially sinful, which ones are not sinful, would be one question. It's possible to categorize them as, this is a good desire that could become sinful, and this is a desire for sin, which is something very different. I think that distinction matters. The other thing that is important, you quoted the phrase, "Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite." One thing that Solomon does, and Hebrew poetry generally does, actually all poetry does, it's kind of the hallmark of poetry, is take a lot of complex ideas and put them in one short, punchy statement. The whole idea is that you're not saying 7 paragraphs, but you're saying almost as much information in one sentence. So when he says, "Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite," he's not condemning all desires. That would actually be a very different philosophical approach. That'd be something more like that says, I just don't have to have joy or sorrow, I'll just be even-keeled. That could be something like a Buddhist approach that would say, if I can just not have desires, then I don't have suffering, then therefore I have something better than this existence. That's not what he's doing. When he says the sight of the eyes, like, that's something that's actually good. Literally, it's better is seeing good. He's saying you desire something. That's not the problem. The problem is when you combine that with the second part, the wandering of the appetite. Having an appetite and having it be satisfied is not inherently bad. Having an appetite that wanders, which I believe what he's getting at there, because of the way he talks about it through the rest of this section, is that when you say, I have a desire for something, and I know that's going to satisfy me, and then it doesn't, and so then you look for the next thing, and I know that's going to satisfy me, and it doesn't, and then you look for the next thing, it wanders. It keeps going from one thing to the next. In other words, if I could put a really modern American paraphrase on this, he's not saying better is the hot dog that you have than the steak that you want. That's not what he's saying. He's saying it's better to enjoy the good in the hot dog that you have than to think the steak will give you ultimate satisfaction. You think it's going to give me ultimate satisfaction, it doesn't, so it wanders to the next thing, and to the next thing, and to the next thing. So overall, I don't think he's condemning desires. I don't think he's condemning thirsts or appetites. In fact, I would say God gave us those things. Now, if we talk about which desires, then you listed some, or we could include some others. We could talk about food and shelter and money. Those are all things that you say you can desire them in a bad way, but you also can desire them in a God-honoring way. You can enjoy them in a God-honoring way. You could talk about safety. We're meant to desire safety. We're motivated by that. God created us with that desire. Not a problem. It gets complicated when you talk about an appetite or a desire for control. And I think the reason is we don't necessarily distinguish influencing something from controlling it. We all want meaningful work. We want to influence things. Where that becomes a problem is when that desire is not just for, I want meaningful, fruitful work, but I want to control, because I'm not God. I'm not made to control the future. It's idolatrous to say, I'm going to control. That's separate from I'm going to wisely do what I can to influence, to do something meaningful. That's a different kind of desire. So actually, I think we smuggle in what's really a good desire is a desire to influence and do something fruitful. The bad desire is I want to control and make sure I'm going to guarantee by my power. I'm going to be the final trust that this happens. I think that appetite, which we do have, is in itself sinful. That's like a desire for I want to lie or I want to murder. But that's not the same thing as saying it's a desire for food. The parallel to that would be a desire for influence or for fruitful work or something like that. So I think if we carefully define what the desire is and recognize that Solomon is saying no desire will give you the ultimate satisfaction your soul craves except your desire for God. No desire will ultimately satisfy you, so it's better to enjoy the good that you can see than to have that wander to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing, expecting ultimate satisfaction. And then we define our desires correctly, we can establish which ones are really sinful in themselves and which ones are only sinful when they are pursued in place of God.
So, along that, a drum that you've beat throughout the sermon series is combating our desire for control. So if God's given us these appetites for various things, is it right to be motivated and driven by these desires? And isn't that an example of us trying to exert some sort of control? I want my family to be fed, so I work hard to make sure I can buy them food. Isn't that a small example of control? And then you can expand that out to, it's okay to be goal-driven as I want this promotion, so I work hard to achieve that promotion. So is it okay to use these desires to motivate us to try to drive towards a goal, or is that kind of goal-driven ethos that's really prevalent in American culture, is that inherently wrong?
I think we often think of our decisions as being right or wrong based on the outcomes in our American culture. It's a wise decision if the business thrives. It's a foolish decision if the business goes under. That's something, though, that I can't know. So as Christians, we're not meant to evaluate the good or badness, the morality of our decisions based on outcomes that we don't know for sure, which are all of the outcomes because I don't know the future, right? So instead of thinking, here is the outcome that must happen, and I'm going to make decisions to guarantee that outcome happens, what we're called to do, we can be driven by goals. I would like to see this happen, and this seems like the best way to pursue it, as long as that's within God's moral parameters, right? Then pursue that. Nothing wrong with setting a goal. I think one of the cleanest biblical examples of this is when God says, don't say, we will go to such and such city and make a profit. He says, say, if the Lord wills, we will go and do this. They still have a goal. They're still going to do it. And obviously, the words, if the Lord wills, is not magic. It's not a magic formula. But if you really do recognize that, you say, my goal is to do this and make a profit. But I recognize I'm not God. It may not happen that way for a million reasons. That's okay. In fact, that's commended. We are to have goals. We are to have wisdom and pursue outcomes that we think are good. Now we're supposed to evaluate our opinion of what's good based on God's opinion of what's good, of course. But it's not wrong to be driven by goals. In fact, I would say it's in Ecclesiastes even, it's wrong to not be driven by goals. It is wrong, and where you can check that is when you think, what if my goal is not met? What does that do for my soul? If that crushes me, if I can't handle it, if my soul's not really safe, if I operate with fear or anxiety because the outcome that I want may not happen, then it tells you there's an underlying desire to be something more than a creature who fears God and keeps his commandments, and instead to be, really, I want to take God's place. I want to make sure I've manipulated everything so this outcome has to happen. I think that's the distinction, which is extremely hard. It's a tension that is absolutely throughout Ecclesiastes, where we wrestle with, I can't control the future, but I should have goals and desires for the future, that I pursue good things. I shouldn't just be passive and say, well, I can't control it, so who cares? I'll just do whatever. No, it's throughout the book, this tension. Pursue good and work, whatever your hand finds to do it with all your might, work hard for good, but realize that you can't ultimately control the outcome. And Solomon he makes us live in that tension for really the whole book.
Ecclesiastes 6 verse 7, we read it earlier, but it says, all the toil of man is for his mouth, and yet his appetite is not satisfied. I've appreciated that Ecclesiastes sometimes seems like a realistic, sounds pessimistic, but it's just taking stock of what life is like. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but I interpret that as a warning that your desire is never going to be satisfied. It's just, you want, you get, and like you said, the natural inclination is for it to be wandering. You want the next thing, and then you want the next thing. We see that with our kids and Christmas toys, and 5 minutes after they've opened a present, they're on to the next present, and once they're done with all the presents, they're thinking about their upcoming birthday. And so I guess, how do we pursue, earlier you said that the only true desire that can be fulfilled is pursuing God. So how do we pursue the enjoyment of God while also pursuing some of these appetites that we have that are even necessary things, like for food, or we want to have good relationships, we want to have meaning in our work? Where do we find the balance of pursuing God while also God's given us these desires, pursuing those in a God-honoring way, and finding that balance with the background knowledge of those other lower desires are never going to be truly satisfied?
I think it's interesting when we think about this satisfaction component. The message most often in Ecclesiastes is, it almost sounds strange. If you ask it this way, how do we pursue enjoying God while also pursuing these other things that we desire? Is that even right? Like, how do we do that, right? And strangely enough, the message that Ecclesiastes gives is you enjoy God by enjoying those things. That's most often his answer. Because what we do often, if I'm looking to money to satisfy, and really it's not just money, I'm looking to money to give me a sense of safety, that I have enough money, I can do what I want to do and be protected. Right? If we push that direction and say I'm looking to money, we don't even enjoy money in that context, generally speaking. We go, oh, but I don't have enough for this problem. Or what if the car breaks? Or what if something happens at the house? Or what if this health thing becomes really expensive? Or what if, and we don't even enjoy it because we're too busy looking to it to satisfy us. And we think that's going to be the answer. And so really, this is not the only answer in Scripture. Ecclesiastes gives us one lens. There's certainly sections of Scripture that talk about things like fasting, which essentially is saying, here's a joy and a desire of food, and I'm going to intentionally not fulfill it out of a desire to point to a deeper spiritual hunger that God can satisfy. Scripture absolutely talks about that. And the Israelites had rhythms of fasts, but they also had rhythms of feasts. And that's what Ecclesiastes points you to, is to say, actually enjoy the food, because the food doesn't have to be anything more than a really good meal. If the food has to be the ultimate satisfaction of every desire you have, it ruins it. It's not going to do that. Then you'll eat it, and maybe it tastes great, and in 4 hours or 6 hours or however many hours, you go, oh, I'm hungry again, I need another one. And so then you do that enough times, and you go, the food's not going to satisfy, it's not even worth enjoying. Right? That's the point over and over. What he does is he says, go enjoy what God has given. So recognizing this comes from God and truly enjoying it, which means I can consume it and go, I have food, I can eat it. I don't have to worry about, will I have food tomorrow? Will I have food in a month? Will I have even better food? I don't have to worry about any of that stuff. I enjoy it right now because God has given it. And obviously we can be wise, and you don't want to be gluttonous, and there's all kinds of things around food. But the basic posture that Solomon points you to is, yes, genuinely enjoy God. And part of that is genuinely enjoying his good gifts. You use the kid in Christmas example, which is a great one. When our kids get a present from their parents, and it is a wonderful present, we all know it would be foolish for that child to think, I have no other desires ever. This is satisfying. This is all that I ever need. No parent actually wants that. We might kind of laugh a little at the fact that they play with it for 5 minutes and then they have no interest in it. But no parent wants them to go, wow, every need is met now. No, we want them to enjoy the gift. One of the things that traditions we have at my house is we buy a bag of dried mango slices for our kids, and that's usually in their stocking on Christmas. I don't want them to save up the mango slices until July 5th from December 25th and be like, I don't know, I might want them later. No, I want them to eat the mango slices. And it's one of the few times at our house where it's like, yeah, have as much as you want, go for it. Because I just want them to enjoy it. That's the gift that's there. And they are enjoying time as a family as we partake in hot chocolate and mango slices and whatever else at that time. That's what Ecclesiastes drives us to, is enjoy God partially by enjoying his good gifts, recognizing that they're from him, and knowing they can never take his place.
So I guess a contrast to that, you talk about the answer to the problem of our appetites is to enjoy them, but under the context of this is a gift that God's given. But you've also said throughout the sermon series and through the podcast episodes, when there are hardships, to truly grieve them. I guess, is dissatisfaction a sin? Is it a failure to enjoy the gifts that God has given? Or can dissatisfaction in something be right when something is genuinely broken, unjust? I guess, where's that balance between God-honoring grief that you turn to him and, I guess, selfish dissatisfaction where you're not viewing God as a good giver?
Yeah, what I would say is the language around vanity that Ecclesiastes uses to talk about various things, particularly here in the enjoyment of God's good gifts. And really, we can see this as there's a certain kind of dissatisfaction that most certainly can be because of sin. Okay, so the answer is sort of like yes and no. Okay, and in other words, sure, if, like Jed was saying, we're chasing security, we're chasing wealth, we're chasing productivity or success as it ends in and of itself that's going to determine ultimate value, ultimate meaning, ultimate purpose, or if I'm just convinced that I can, by my own effort, apart from, to use the phrase that James uses, God's will, right? And I can fabricate them on my own. That very, very often, and often very quickly, is going to lead to dissatisfaction. And in that case, yes, you would be morally responsible for that. You have a hand to play in that because you have essentially exchanged the posture of humble, joyful, grateful receptivity, right? Where your hand is out to the giver of every good and perfect gift, right? Comes from above. And you've said, I'm going to make my life and my world what it is, right? And we're a lot poorer. We're a lot worse at making our life enjoyable than God is. And that's actually a wonderful thing that we're not as good as God at doing that. But then secondly, it itself acknowledges like the tears of those who are oppressed, okay, and these kinds of things. And so it does have a category of legitimate, of where he's looking around and you have these ups and downs and these patterns of life and things that we're not in control of. They're just a part of every life, the righteous and the unrighteous. And he goes, vanity. Now, again, it doesn't mean that these things are meaningless or that there's not a divine answer, like a solution to these things in the world, but that is acknowledged in Ecclesiastes. And I think it's part of the reason why he's saying these things are like chasing after the wind. And that's actually part of the message and inherent to it. So just as much as joy and the enjoyment of God's good gifts are there, I think it was just recently where Jed preached a sermon saying, hey, mourn those things that are legitimately mournable. And I think also just remembering that this is one book out of many that God has inspired. So whatever is here is not in competition with what's elsewhere. And we have it very clearly written for us. Weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. In fact, that's borrowing from, if you will, the wisdom formulas of the Old Testament. That kind of idiom, that kind of way of speaking is exactly Jewish wisdom. You know what I mean? That's where it comes from when the New Testament's doing that. Yes, we should lament and mourn the things that are lamentable. But for example, I can have a hard meeting with someone that's going through something really hard and weep with them, right? And that in and of itself, let's say it's some injustice, some oppression, some sin that maybe they're guilty of, that they're lamenting. I'm not going to pretend like that's a good thing. I'm going to lament and mourn and weep with respect to that. But let's say I go home and my children are playing and I notice one of my children has a toy and the other child really wants it. And out of the love in their own heart, they share it joyfully. That's also something. You say in the span of an hour that can happen. That's also something that in and of itself is worthy of saying praise God for that and rejoicing in.
I wonder if it's worth distinguishing. We don't make this distinction often, but I think the ideas in Ecclesiastes do. distinguishing satisfaction in something, or being satisfied, an appetite being satisfied, and joy in something. I'm thinking illustrations. This past summer I went to the beach, and you can sit there and try to crash into the waves. You can feel like you're trying to stop the waves. It will never work. Of course, they keep coming. But you can enjoy that, even though you never quench the ocean. It doesn't stop. And I think what he does sometimes in Ecclesiastes, here when he says, all the toil of a man is for his mouth, yet his appetite is not satisfied. So notice, all the toil of the man, he's working, and it is bringing food. It's for his mouth. He is eating. And in the context of what he said repeatedly in the book, enjoy the food that you've been given. He's supposed to have joy, and yet it's not satisfied in the sense that you're always going to have. Now, I know temporarily, of course, you eat enough and you go, oh, I'm satisfied. We don't mean permanently satisfied. We mean satisfied in a fleeting way, which is very much what Ecclesiastes talks about, is fleetingness. This doesn't last. If you think of it like you're filling up your bucket and your bucket leaks, my enjoyment leaks. I have joy in this thing. Now, where we find frustration is when, instead of saying, I'm going to fill up this bucket, I'm going to enjoy it, and then I know it's going to leak, and I'm going to have this desire again, we start going, no, I have to make sure that it doesn't leak. I have to make sure that I have all this, and I always have this joy, and only this joy, and not this sorrow. And then we get all spun up in anxiety at that point, in fear and frustration. And so if we look at that, dissatisfaction, the fact that I will still have desires, and no desire ultimately permanently fulfills, except God, dissatisfaction is not a sin. That's just being a creature. That's just finite. Nothing sinful about that. The sin is actually trying to be a creature who would be fully permanently satisfied in something other than God. That's idolatry, because I'm saying I'm going to control this. Something is going to satisfy me completely, permanently, and it's not going to be God. It's going to be something else. That's the sin that's there. So the book tells you, have joy. Have joy. You will never be satisfied the way you really want to in any of those things. And the other illustration that came to my mind, and in some ways it sounds hard, and if you're listening to this going through a really hard time, I understand that this is hard to live out. But if you imagine, let's say you start a business, you're running a business, and things start to go south, and somebody comes in and they defraud you of money, and you go, I just don't even know what on earth we're going to do. You go like, I can't pay my bills, my business is going to go under, I might lose my house, whatever. You're thinking all that stuff. And I realize this might sound naive, but I really do think it's what Solomon's pointing at in the book. And we'll say a brother in Christ from church, you don't know what's going on in his life. He doesn't know what's going on in your life. God lays him on your heart. He shows up to your house and he brings you, I don't know, your favorite coffee. Hey, I just thought of you, wanted to give this to you. Now you can sit here and go, there's no joy to be found in that. My world is absolutely falling apart. There's stuff to mourn here. And there is. You should mourn it. You should go, there's evil here, there's injustice, you've been robbed, whatever it is, right? There's evil, there's injustice, there's just time and chance. There's everything the book talks about that you can mourn. But I do think what Solomon is pointing us to is to say, if you're given a gift like that, there is joy to be found there. In the middle of the sorrow, there can be real joy. And that's extreme. Most of our lives aren't that extreme. Most of our lives, it's like, God provided a couple $100 through this thing that I didn't expect, and oh, there's a bill that's a couple $100. Most of our lives actually work like that. But I still, in that context, even if you flip it around, you go, oh, I lost $100 over here I had to spend, I wish I didn't, and God's given me $1,000 from this gift, and I can still be tied up in knots over the $100. Which Solomon is saying, mourn the sadness, but don't lose the joys. Because you think, I've got to be permanently satisfied in these things. Enjoy what's there. Enjoy God as the giver. And I think that he is calling us to this kind of vibrant experience where we genuinely feel joys and genuinely feel sorrows within this same life. And even the thread of satisfaction, I was thinking John 4 when Jesus talks to the woman at the well. And he says, I'll give you living water that will be a well of water springing up inside you. I love that picture because the way he talks about it isn't that we will become something more than creatures. It's not that we won't have desires. It's not that you won't get thirsty. When he says you'll never thirst again, why? Because the water is inside you. It's with you. It's always available. In other words, there, he's not saying, I'm going to remove part of your creatureliness by making you not have any thirsts. He's saying, I will permanently be with you, a well of water springing up inside you, so that you will find satisfaction and satisfaction. Not permanent because you're a creature and you can't, but permanent because he's not a creature, he's the creator and he's with you. And so this sense of like, we always will be desiring, but Jesus says, I want you to come and be satisfied. The only place you ultimately can with God.
It reminds me of just the whole, this may be a little bit of a tangent, but on the thinking about our desires and wrestling with our desires. I was watching a video recently from, I think his name is Adam Savage. He's one of the Mythbusters, and he now has a podcast, and he's a very creative guy, has all these projects, and he was talking about completion depression. Mm-hmm. So when you get to the end of a project, you often feel depressed, and that's why a lot of times people will start a project and never quite finish because they want to hold on to that joy of moving towards a project. And there's this I think of it as not knowing how to complete a project and actually hold on to that satisfaction, because it's all, like it talks about here, the sight of the eyes is better than the wandering of the appetite. We crave that wandering of the appetite. I keep pursuing something, and then once you get it, then the pursuit's gone. And some of these verses have helped me realize, people sometimes talk about holding on to gratitude and stuff, but as Christians, we actually have a target that we can point our gratitude to. Mm-hmm. So if you have a business venture and then it closes down and you're like, God, thank you for this time. Or you have a family and then your kids go off to college and there can be a major letdown of emotions. And it's like, thank you for this time. And yeah, there is a sadness of, okay, the thing I was pursuing of having a happy family with all my kids at home, that's now gone, but I can enjoy it and be thankful. And if you don't hold on to that, then like you said earlier, without that thankfulness and without putting it in its place, it ruins it. Because if you are a parent that's just trying to hold your kids at home all the way through college and past college, and now they're in their 30s and they're still living in your basement, you've messed something up by trying to exhibit that control over it. But if you allow it to be what it is and move on, then you can enjoy it in its proper place.
And sometimes we want the joy of pursuing, like you said. There's another emotional response with that too, and that's fear, because a lot of times we're afraid when I finish this, it's not going to be good enough. And if we examine that carefully, many times we're actually right, it's not going to be good enough. But finish the sentence, good enough for what? It's not going to be good enough to make my soul feel this permanent satisfaction in how wonderful it is. No, it's not. It's never going to be that good. You work on the project, you write a song, or you paint a picture, or whatever, and once you finish it, then everybody can come go, I don't love that part, and even you'll do it. I used to write songs, a lot of times I would write at night because it feels easier to do creative processes late at night. I wrote some songs that sounded amazing at 11:30 at night that sounded terrible the next morning at 8. And nothing changed except me. And there's this sense of, if I finish this, then I'm afraid it won't be good enough. And it might not be, depending on what you want it to be. Can it be a good thing? Sure. Is it going to satisfy your soul? Is it going to make the appetite truly be satisfied? In fact, that word for appetite here literally is soul. His appetite, his soul is not satisfied. He's talking about this kind of internal posture of your soul, this desire. He's like, this is never going to permanently fill you. And if you expect it to, you ruin everything along the way.
God's good gifts were never meant to satisfy our souls, but we can receive them with gratitude, enjoy them for what they are, and worship the God who gave them. Next time on Reverberate, we will talk about control. Ecclesiastes calls on us to realize that we cannot control the outcome of our lives. Yet, isn't every time we try to make a wise decision an attempt to shape the outcome? How can we make wise choices without trying to take the control that belongs only to God? We hope you'll listen in.